You are listening to Missed Apex Podcast. We live F1. Hi everyone, Spanners here. Today we once again are looking back to the past, to the great personalities and champions and how their careers unfolded. And today we're going to be talking about the two-time world champion, the very popular flying Finn Mika Häkkinen. Joining me is someone who has done research and has a memory and therefore an advantage over me. It's Chris Catman Turner back again to delve into history. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Spanners. I love this section of the podcast. It's fantastic to just dissect the rivalries that got us interested in Formula One in the first place.
It's great because you do all the work and research and spend time looking back, which you love and don't even see as work. And I had a cursory glance at your notes. So I'm going to be rediscovering everything for the first time. I think since that era, I've never had the urge to go back and look at Mika Häkkinen's career. And I know this isn't very popular, but at the time, I don't remember rating Mika Häkkinen. I thought it was one of those things where people had their moment after a career. They have the moment at the top, and then he Rosberged it out of there.
Yeah, he certainly did. It was after he had a family in 2001 that he decided to take a sabbatical. And I think there's some rumor that he's still on sabbatical, but we shall.
I think
we
he's officially quashed that one. So I think that joke can go to bed now. He has described himself as retired.
Shame. Never mind. I was hoping he'd come back. But yeah, so back at the time, I thought he was very, very fast and possibly the best guy to take on Michael Schumacher. But we'll get into whether we think that he's, say, the greatest of the two-time world champions, see if he's actually overrated or underrated. We'll have to wait and see.
Oh, yeah, because we did who was the best one-time world champion, didn't we? Who won that? I can't remember who won that.
It was Rosberg versus Mansell.
So Mansell definitely won. No arguments. Shut up. How's that?
Absolutely. And then this one, I guess, would be Alonso versus Hakkinen. So we'll have to see who wins that.
So let's set ourselves the era that we're in. Now, you were talking about the best placed person to face Michael Schumacher. Michael Schumacher, of course, was in the sport, but this was before Michael Schumacher was Michael Schumacher. And so we're really talking about Mika Häkkinen arriving into the sport in a time where it's Prost versus Senna. So shall we start from the very beginning of Mika Häkkinen's career?
Let's. And we can. So he came in to Formula One with the Lotus team. We're looking at what Ferrari was spending was about 80 million a year versus Lotus, who are only spending about 8. You're never going to be able to compete on those sorts of terms. So they were just chucking bits at the car. The car was overweight, which of course is not Lotus's philosophy at all. And bits introduced partway through the season, B-spec cars. But I guess when you're looking at the drivers, that's not really what you look at. You're looking at whether you're going to be beating your teammate. And he was up against people like Johnny Herbert, and he compared very well against Johnny. And that's what got him noticed in the Lotus.
And then you have to put yourself back and go, well, actually, how was Johnny Herbert rated at the time? So he was really highly rated coming through the junior series, but this is after he's had the crash that has hurt his ankles, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. He didn't really get to show what he could do in F1 before he had that kind of incident. So Johnny was, as you said, a very highly regarded driver, but I think certainly he never got to get to the peak of what he could have got to because of that accident. But Mika, he was also very highly rated from the junior formulae, but it was, I think, his third race for Lotus where he started in 25th, believe it or not, when there were that many cars. And he made it up to 5th place in the race. And don't forget, there are only points up till 6 in that stage. So in that race, it was a big race of attrition, of course, but he did make up some good moves and managed to get that high. And that's how he got really noticed in the Lotus.
Oh, well, you seem to be describing a fluke, Catman.
That is one of the problems I have when I was looking back through Mika's career, is I was always looking back and seeing what were his best performances. And it always seemed to come on the back of, I guess, misfortune for other people or misfortune of his own making, then he then had to make up. So yeah, it's a very interesting one that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I want to actually see if you're going to change my mind and make me go, oh, actually, Mika Häkkinen, oh yeah, he was this great legend in F1. And actually, when I was looking back and reading it, you go, oh, hang on a minute. you can't accidentally win 2 world titles, but they might not be the best, most prestigious, most classic world titles out there. So, look, I mean, the biggest example, of course, is going to be the second one with the Michael Schumacher injury. I don't want to skip ahead too quickly, though, because you've got some really interesting stuff in the notes about the driver merry-go-round between Williams and and McLaren, and everything could have been so different.
Absolutely. And actually, there's discussions going on in the background at this point where you could have changed the complexion of the 90s and the noughties Formula One. So Mika Häkkinen, as I said, impressed at Lotus, and then he had a contract written up and signed to go to Williams for 1993 instead of Damon Hill. So he would have been alongside Alan Prost, who won the championship in 93 at Williams. But there was some quite in-depth contract disputes that we won't necessarily go into, but his Lotus team boss at the time basically threatened to boycott Williams and get them thrown out of the championship because they'd lodged their entry a few days late, and then they had to get all the teams to sign off on them coming in. And they said, well, if you keep going after Mika, we won't let you in. So obviously that was a non-starter. And then he decided to go for McLaren instead. And obviously that's not going to be the route to immediate success because they weren't at the top at that point. Williams were dominating with their active suspension car. But he felt that he would be treated better at McLaren. And history, I think, does point to the Williams team not necessarily having the best respect for their drivers with the light bulb philosophy.
Yeah, go on, tell us the light bulb philosophy.
Yeah, so Frank Williams and Patrick Head had this idea that if you built the car, you could basically plug in whichever driver that you wanted to, and it would win the championship. So the driver was secondary, and as they showed with the way that they treated Prost, Mansell, and Damon Hill, and Villeneuve, to be honest with you, every single one just seemed to be at the peak of their success. And then they go, "You're getting too expensive. We'll move you on."
Yeah, I think that's a fairly short-sighted philosophy, the light bulb one. It has a point, but especially when you are looking at the drivers of that era, I think it's a much more vulnerable point. So if you don't build the car, there's no point going after any driver. It doesn't matter. So if you've got a back of the grid car, you are more looking for someone who could be, reliable, a good tester, fits in with your budget. However, at that time, you would have quite a lot of disparity between, say, Eddie Irvine, I don't know how controversial I'm being here, and your Ayrton Senna. And I think back then, pay drivers were pay drivers. You're probably not going to compare Pedro Diniz even to a modern Lance Stroll. The guys who we call pay drivers now have still had to come through a lot of racing and still had stiff competition. So I don't hate that philosophy because you go, the car is the most important thing, that engineering is the most important thing. But to suggest that you could have the best car and then in the 90s put the 2 worst drivers in and it wouldn't matter, that I think is a stretch.
Yeah, absolutely. But even nowadays, you look at, I don't want to bring this one up, but Verstappen versus Perez, for example, the fact that the field is so close makes a big difference. Back then, the cars were a second a lap apart. So the Williams was a second faster than McLaren. So even if you put somebody who was comparatively not as good, you would still rely on the car to get you into that P1 and P2. So as long as you had somebody who was fairly decent, you'd be able to get them there. But you're right in that the field spread from the drivers was dramatic, shall we say. There was, as you said, the pay drivers would not have much racing experience at all. They would literally just be funding the cars to be there and just to poodle around. So there was definitely a bigger talent gap, shall we say, from the top to the bottom. But when we're talking about the champion teams and that sort of thing, they never really went that far down. But people like Damon Hill, for example, when he came in, he was quite old. He had very little car racing experience. He was a motorbike guy. And you could say that this is probably going against both of our childhood hero aspirations here. But I think Damon Hill probably may not have been the most talented of drivers of the era, shall we say.
Hey, that doesn't matter. As Brits, we spotted Tim Henman at tennis. We supported the England football team that just were cursed in every penalty shootout. I don't think ever won a penalty shootout my entire childhood in a knockout tournaments before eventually just giving up on qualifying for them altogether. So Damon Hill can be a hero, can be a national idol, and he was our representative in motorsport for that particular time period, without the need to look back and claim that he was somehow the greatest. Now, this makes me laugh when people talk about Senna, would beat the modern grid, or Senna would be a great driver now, or some people even stretch that to Fangio would be a great driver now. There is no way you could come into Formula One now not having had any history in car racing, kart racing, not gone through that ladder, tip up in Formula One, get into the right car and be world champion. I don't think that's going to happen. Whereas obviously it was more common back then. I will maintain, and people don't like this, that Lance Stroll is probably of a higher talent than Ayrton Senna. And I think our conversation will probably get more into that as we talk about comparisons between Senna and Hakkinen as teammates. Sorry, I know I've gone off on a tangent there. It's just that as much as we all like Damon Hill is not going to go down as one of the all-time greats. He was in the right place at the right time and took one of the opportunities presented to him. But yes, I mean, Senna is very much involved in this story in the transfer market. So I struggle to get my head around it, but Prost didn't want Senna there at Williams.
That's right. He vetoed Senna going to Williams. So basically, Honda were retiring from F1 at the end of 1992. So that was the end of McLaren dominance as far as Senna could see. So he decided to quit the team and even offered to drive for Williams for absolutely nothing, for free, just so that he could get in a competitive car to try and win that next championship. But as I say, Prost vetoed that because he didn't want to take him back on again, given their history together, shall we say.
I think Senna called Prost a coward in a press conference, and I'm purely going from memories at the time, but you were saying, yeah, you're a coward, you don't want to compete against me. I think from Prost, that is entirely fair. You're the incumbent in the team. Why would you, for the sake of fairness, go, oh no, let's bring in my deadly rival to share my brilliant car that I've gotten myself into the position of being in?
Absolutely. And why would you do that, being the number one, being the head guy, especially with somebody who has beaten you in the past? And I think the thing for Alain Prost was he didn't want to have that instability in the team. He's somebody who liked stability and liked them to be all about him. So having Prost and Senna in the car would not have worked at all. Senna was undoubtedly faster than Alain Prost, shall we say. When they were teammates in McLaren, Senna would more often finish ahead of Prost when they both finished on the track. Prost was very quick, but he was more of a strategy guy than, say, an out-and-out pace guy, and he could get the most out of the situation that he was in. But yeah, why would he want to risk that? And actually, interestingly, he'd already written that into his contract before Senna had even tried to go to Williams. He said, I have a veto on whoever wants to be in that number 2 seat, thinking that Senna would probably want to poach it at some point. So anyway, so Senna decided then, okay, fine, I'll have to go back to McLaren because nobody else is going to be able to challenge them at all. So he went to McLaren and said, right, what can you offer me for the season? And they said, right, we'll give you 5 million to race for the whole year. And Senna said, that's absolute peanuts. So he agreed to race by race on a £1 million contract. And if that money wasn't in his account
per
by
race,
the Thursday of the race, per race. So this is so essentially 16 million quid for the race for the year.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't there, they would have to find somebody else to put in there. So in the intervening time, Hakkinen had signed to race for McLaren for 1993. But they bumped him back to the test driver role
because of
so
Senna.
that Senna could be
by the way,
back in the lineup.
For Senna to know, okay, I don't know if he's going to call his bank. I'm just imagining Ayrton Senna going, right, I have to go to an ATM and I check my balance. Right, it's £1 million has been deposited in there and has cleared. All right, let's go to the practice session. That's quite a funny one. And you put yourself in Senna's position as a superstar at that time, trying to get himself the best drive, and I'll drive for Williams for free. But when it comes to McLaren, who he raced with previously, he's now demanding £1 million a race, and if you don't deposit it, I'm going to leave. That's not great. that doesn't scream sort of teamwork, camaraderie. It's a very mercenary contract, and it doesn't scream team spirit. I know everyone needs to get paid, but if you're going and racing somewhere for free, you go, you really believe in this project. If your driver, who had agreed to race for a different team for free, is now getting super, super arsey and like, oh, you need to make sure the money's there on the dot about your team, I don't know how good that makes everyone feel at McLaren.
No, and it absolutely screams of that Senna volatility, doesn't it? He definitely was that sort of guy who would just play people off against each other, and he was a flawed genius. I think a lot of people call him, because he was so contrary a lot of the time. But yeah, so he did manage to get into that car, and he did stay for the whole season. So Hakkinen only got his debut for McLaren at Estoril most of the way through the season, because Ayrton Senna had won. This was round 12 of 16. Senna had 3 wins and 2 poles, despite not having the best engine, the best car, that sort of thing. He'd actually end up second in the championship behind Prost, so he did a mighty good fist of it, despite not having that car. By that point of the season, Andretti had 3 points compared to Senna's many points.
This is Andretti at McLaren, so this is Michael Andretti.
Yes. No, this is
Mario.
No, it's Michael Andretti. Yes, sorry, I get the two confused, don't I? Yeah. So yeah, you were right the first time.
Yeah.
So Michael Andretti, yeah, he had 3 points. He had a lot of retirement problems, but also just a lot of crashes and spins, and wasn't getting used to the car. He'd come over from kart, and they didn't have the active suspension or the traction control or anything like that. So he was finding it much more difficult. So they eventually punted him out and put Mika in there. And Mika, on his first race, so this is in an era when they could test.
Yeah, infinite testing. Yeah.
Absolutely. So he knew the car inside out. And the two Williamses were miles ahead. But he managed to qualify ahead of Senna by 0.05 of a second, which is unknown for basically somebody who was a rookie to come in and defeat the god that was Ayrton Senna. People didn't think it was possible. I think the only person who might have thought it was possible was Hakkinen. And Senna actually asked him afterwards how he did it. And Mika just cracked a joke at him. And
what joke?
Didn't...
How do we know this?
He didn't reveal what the joke was, but I don't think it was very complimentary. And Senna was quite angry with that.
Okay,
but yes.
So this is where it relates to what I was harping on about before and banging my drum of just how quickly the standards improved and changed. So you could probably say, and this is if the Senna documentary or the Senna movie. Have you seen the Senna movie on Netflix, the newer one?
I've not seen the new.
Oh, it's a TV series.
I've seen the movie. I've not seen the very anti-British one.
Oh, it's amazing. So it's it's dubbed. I didn't even realize it was dubbed. They did quite a good job on the dubbing. But yeah, the Brits are portrayed horrendously. So you're going, we don't want him here. He's not even British. God, Senna, boo, go away. And you go, right, well, the generation that Senna was coming through and his experience, his launch into it, and what he would have had to have done to get into Formula One, when you go to Mika Häkkinen, who's 8 years younger, that's already kind of the next generation coming through. And I think what we see is a really rapidly evolving period of generations of drivers being much better than the ones before and quickly making them obsolete. So for Häkkinen to come in as a rookie and beat Senna, I don't think in the cold light of day you should see that as surprising, now that we know how much better drivers got, that trajectory to go, well, okay, yeah, this new generation came in, much more hours, probably a bigger competition pool, a bigger pool of drivers to get through as well. And, maybe, I'm guessing here a bit, but more junior series driving. It shouldn't really be that much of a surprise that he managed to pip him in qualifying.
True, but this was somebody that everybody's seen as the best talent of ever beforehand. And don't forget also, this is a time of tech improvement as well. So the semi-auto gearbox had just been introduced. So instead of having to use your left foot for the clutch and then your right foot to brake and accelerate, they just introduced the flappy paddles, or a shifter where you don't have to use a clutch pedal. And so Senna, from the era before, was braking with his right foot, so heel and toe style stuff. Whereas Hakkinen was brought up with semi-auto gearboxes, so was a left foot braker. So there's definitely an advantage, and this is where that is first starting to come in. And that's what Hakkinen, I think, puts down to the difference between the two on that day in particular was the left versus right foot braking.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I would never imagine myself doing the heel toe. So the heel toe is you're essentially using one foot to switch between the accelerator and the brake. And I can't, if it seems too hard, I can't be bothered doing that, especially at my level with sim racing. And the only real world driving I've really done is karting, where you've got your left foot braking. And they're two very separate functions. And surprisingly, I never get confused between driving a road car and then either jumping in the sim or the kart, where you've got your left foot dedicated to braking and you're hitting it a lot harder. If you ever try left foot braking in your road car, don't do this, by the way. don't do it.
I nearly put myself through the front windscreen when I tried it once.
Yeah, because if you go from racing in your sim, especially with load cell pedals, left foot braking, or in a go-kart, and then you go and try and do that in your road car, you will hit that brake pedal way, way harder than you're expecting. And like you say, throw yourself through the mirror. And when I was driving a Porsche, a listener said to me, "Do you want to drive my Porsche around Palmer Sport?" The answer to that will generally be yes, please. Let me drive your Porsche around Palmer Sport. But that's obviously a road car. So getting into the braking zone and braking right-footed and then trying to get back on the power, it's really, really difficult. And I can imagine that if you've grown up right-foot braking heel-toe and then you switch to the left foot braking, I think that is quite a fundamental, and I wouldn't underestimate how big a difference that is.
Absolutely. And no matter how quick you are at changing between the two, you're never going to be as quick as if your foot is already on the pedal. So you're always going to have a little bit of lag there. So it's never at the peak going to be as fast a technique. So that's why they moved towards it with the semi gearboxes and the left foot braking. So that was definitely we'll call it a changing of the guard. Obviously, it didn't come for a number of years, but the techniques were definitely changing.
Yeah, it's amazing how godlike Senna was. So Senna was Xerxes of Formula One, and Hakkinen showed that even a god driver can be beaten slightly in qualifying. So I think we should bear that in mind even when we're looking at modern F1. People build these reputations much more easily than they would in a spec series. So in a spec series, if you look at Formula E, you're getting different winners all the time, championships much more up for grabs. In Formula One, there's only 3 or 4 drivers who are going to get a shot at a title. Generally, at most, it's 3 or 4 drivers. And if they stay at the top teams tend to farm from the top drivers. It's quite easy for someone to build up a reputation over a few series of being a god. So, like Vettel at one point was absolutely untouchable. And then he had years and years and years where that reputation of being untouchable slowly sort of, went away. So, yeah, Senna, I think, was always going to get overtaken by that new generation.
I totally agree. And it was a very different time where things were very up and down. There's a lot more car unreliability in that era. There was so much going on that it meant that progress was inevitable. And people like Michael Schumacher, I think, changed the sport forever in terms of the professionalism and the ability that was there. And it's still going on. You could argue that even putting Schumacher in nowadays, he may not have been able to cope with the likes of Verstappen. So, there's progress and that's inevitable.
All right. So we've got Mika Häkkinen at McLaren. Eventually, Senna disappears that season. I can't remember.
Yeah, he leaves in 1994 for Williams, and then so he.
Right.
So,
It's they finished the season out, Hakkinen and Senna. It's Andretti that yields.
Yeah, Andretti goes back to America. They have 3 races together where Senna beats Hakkinen, but he gets his first podium out at the next race in Japan. And he's within a tenth of Senna in qualifying. So he's definitely got that talent there. But then Senna moves to Williams, and then we don't get a decent comparison anymore because he's up in 94 and 95. Fairly unremarkable seasons for McLaren. They get a bit of a in the doldrums, shall we say. They've not got great car designs. Their engines, they're shifting between Peugeot and Lamborghini, I think at one stage they had. But yeah, so there was lots of different change there, and McLaren weren't really, they were rebuilding for the next era at this point, if that makes sense. And And then, of course, we go to 1995 when Mika had his huge accident at Adelaide, which nearly killed him.
You're going to have to describe this for me. I don't know why this hasn't... This is prime F1 watching time for me. Or is it that there was so many horrific crashes that it was, oh, well, it's just another bad crash?
Yeah, that was the problem. I think, obviously, following on from 1994... it was the first time when there'd been deaths in Formula 1 and 2 on the same weekend, so it was all a big shock. And then in 95 it nearly happened again. So in Adelaide there's I don't know if you remember much about the Adelaide circuit, but there was the really long straight with a big right kink in it, and it was called the Brewery Bend, and he was going up towards that corner and his left rear got a puncture, similar to the same place that Nigel Mansell got his puncture that lost him the championship. But it was further up towards the corner, just before he was about to turn in. And his car skewed sideways and then hit a curb and started flying. And of course, if you're in the air, you're not slowing down. So he then hit a wall front on at 120 miles an hour. His helmet hit the steering wheel because it didn't have the head and neck safety device. So his head hit the steering wheel, fractured his skull, and his airway got blocked. So he was moments away from passing. So the safety crew managed to do an emergency tracheostomy. So they managed to open his airway at the circuit and then put him into an induced coma. And he was like that for a few days. So, and this is like the last race of the season. So you think, well, he's not going to be back for 1996. If at all, is he going to make it back? And he was back to his best in 1996 at the first race of the season. So which was in Melbourne. So, in the same country. So I don't think he actually went home at that point. He just literally stayed in Australia and then went on in 1996 to race again. And he was doing fantastically well. But again, in 1996, he's up against David Coulthard at this stage.
So, we're into that era. So yeah. This is David Coulthard and Mika Häkkinen in their West liveried McLarens.
For 96, it was the Marlborough still, and then in 1997 they went into their West McLarens. And actually, yeah, we'll skip over 96. There wasn't much that was.
Well, I'll linger on the liveries. While you were talking there, I was desperately trying to find footage of the crash because it's just not in my head. And you're describing something spectacular, and I go, why don't I remember that? So I will find a video to that, and I will put it in the link in the show notes as well, and make sure that you go and follow the link to Catman's social media. He'll be Catman F1 probably on Blue Sky and Twitter.
That's right.
So we'll link to you there as well. And just so you know our plans, we are still doing a news show on Sunday. There's actually loads of news stories coming out as well. And I've just started watching Drive to Survive, and I have some opinions. So we're going to have watched all of Drive to Survive by then. We're not going to do like a review of Drive to Survive, but some of the key points that have come out of it, we'll discuss some of the stories and points coming out of that. So the liveries, the red and white one. Now I'm aware that these are tobacco sponsors, and I'm not endorsing it, but these are liveries from my childhood, so I can't let what I think is an incredibly evil industry, because whatever. You're not here for my political views, but I'm just saying I'm not endorsing it. But the McLarens to me should be red and white. So when I think of McLaren, I always think red and white. I know they're trying to make papaya happen. We'll see. But there was a very distinct period with this West livery as well. So you define that era of McLaren with the Coulthard-Hakkinen pairing.
Absolutely. And that was an iconic livery in itself with the little red nose. It was a beautiful car. And actually some of the best looking cars I've ever seen were the 98 and 99 McLarens. They were simple and they had beautiful car designs and they were nimble in the corners. This was one of the era where we got the groove tires and they were slipping and sliding all over the place. They were hard to control and they made a beautiful noise. I don't know if you remember the McLarens making a very distinctive howl in comparison to the rest of the grid at that point.
Do an impression. No, don't worry.
I'm going to be like the guy at Cota who has got on the microphone. Yeah. So in 1997, then in the West McLaren, in 97, do you remember what happened at Jerez at the final Grand Prix?
Nope.
With between Villeneuve and Schumacher.
Oh, right, yes.
Title deciding clash.
It didn't work this time, Michael, is the commentary from Murray Walker.
Exactly. So that left Villeneuve struggling towards the end with a damaged car and the two McLarens racing right up behind. Initially it was Coulthard, but then Mika overtook, and then he overtook Villeneuve to take the win, which was his first victory, and that was fantastic. But it's slightly more controversial than most people remember or even realise. So the reason that DC let Mika pass, and it wasn't an overtake on merit, Mika shouldn't have won the race. DC was ahead and the final pit stops, but then the team asked DC to let Mika through. Ron Dennis thought that it might be better to have two winners because David had already won a couple of races that year. And he thought it'd be better to have a couple of people who'd won, a couple of their drivers who'd won, to give them a bit of a morale boost. And obviously Hakkinen was his favourite as well. But yeah, so they asked DC to let him through. So that was a gifted first win.
I don't know how well that would go down now. It's like a consolation prize. Okay. But I suppose there's no title on the line. It's the end of the season. And maybe David Coulthard is thinking, I'll just keep my bosses happy.
Yeah, I guess so. But I mean, even people like Lando and Piastri nowadays, or nobody would let that happen now. I think DC, as we'll go on to discuss in 1998 with Mika's second victory, did a similar thing. I don't think people would do that nowadays. I think DC was held himself to a different standard, shall we say, and whether that was the right thing to do or the cutthroat thing to do that gets you to win championships is another.
Yeah, so now we're entering the business end of Mika Häkkinen's career. So thus far, he's been a talented, talked about, fancied driver with a good reputation. But really, it's all been in the background of Prost versus Senna. And then Damon Hill's challenge, so Hill versus Schumacher for a couple of years. And then this last season that we were describing was Williams versus Ferrari, so Schumacher versus Villeneuve as well. And then I think it was a bit of a surprise to have McLaren suddenly pop up. That's my memory of it in 98 and be an incredibly dominant car, like super duper more than Mercedes 2014 dominant car.
Absolutely. And you could argue that 1998 McLaren was the most dominant car of all time. It had the biggest winning margin in that first race. So Mika and DC, the race went not perfectly to plan. They did have other things going on that we'll go into, but they managed to lap the whole field up to third place. So, there was only the two McLarens on that winning lap. And I think they knew that coming into the race. So Mika and DC made an agreement. So the first driver to the first corner, whoever got there first, would lead the race and would be unchallenged for the rest of the race. And so when Mika had a couple of problems during the race, he got to the corner first, but then during the race, he actually came into the pits when the team weren't ready for him. So they had to wave him through. So essentially did a drive through. And then on his stop when he actually was meant to stop, they then had a bit of a problem with the actual pit stop itself. So it was slow. So that put him out behind David Coulthard. So DC led the rest of the race, but a couple of laps from the end, he mysteriously slowed and then let Mika past. So, as I say, both of Mika's first and second wins were handed to him by DC.
Yeah, okay. Okay, the slight pushback on that is they did have an agreement, so it wasn't handed to him because the only thing that mattered in the race was who got to the first corner first, right? And Hakkinen got to the first corner first. Therefore, he won the race. That's it. So it wasn't handed to him. He won the agreed part of the race. I hate it, though.
He won the launch from the 200-meter sprint, which is not what a Sunday is about. But yeah, I don't understand why they even made that agreement in the first place. I don't even know if Mika expected DC to stick to it, to be honest with you.
So that was race one, right?
That was race one.
And they knew they had a dominant car. So they probably picked up from testing that they had a dominant car. And then they might just have sort of panicked and gone, well, we don't want to be taking each other out. We don't know how long the dominance is going to last. They've not been in that position before. And I think that's one of those decisions you look back and you go, oh, why did we do that? Why didn't we just race? But those kind of agreements are never going to look good. They're never going to make anyone feel good. I wonder if it was anyone else but David Coulthard, whether it would have been respected, or you would just find a reason to go, well, I said I wouldn't challenge you. I found myself ahead. That's not my fault. So yeah, I didn't challenge you. I'm just ahead. So I'm going to go off and win the race. And you'd get a situation we had with McLaren in 2024 with them begging Norris to yield that position. But that was a very similar position as well, because, you know, Norris was overtaken by Piastri, I think, lap 1. Is that what happened? And then just how the pit stops worked out, Norris ended up ahead. Right?
Yeah, so Norris was behind Piastri before the pit stops, but Lewis was catching them up, and he was in that undercut window, which they had to protect against for Norris. So Norris pitted first. That then, of course, gave him the undercut on Piastri. So when Piastri pitted, Norris was out in front. And so McLaren said, well, we would normally give our priority to the lead driver to pick when they pit first. And
therefore,
we wouldn't. Yeah. So then the crucial bit is the team told Norris to give the position back to Piastri. They didn't say, they didn't agree it beforehand. It was a case of, well, we've disadvantaged our leading driver, so therefore that's how it should go. And then they thought about it, and then he eventually did. Whereas this wasn't dictated by the team at all, unlike the previous race in Jerez. But with this one, it was just between the two. The team weren't expecting DC to actually uphold this one.
Yeah, I don't like it. I don't like that they would take that upon themselves. Nope. But even with the McLaren one, it was super clumsy, because what you're doing is you sort of giving Piastri the credit for following through and winning the race, and basically saying, as soon as we were forced to give Norris an advantage, the race is over, because we were always just going to give that back to you. Norris then had no longer any opportunity to race. And that's the team imposing it. But even in this situation, to go, all right, you're ahead at the first turn, therefore I'm not going to challenge you. And you're sitting there with more pace or sitting there with better tyre wear, and you just go, what am I doing? Like, especially at that time, there was 8 weeks between each Grand Prix, and now you've got to sit there and wait for the next race. You've wasted that entire opportunity to actually go racing. It's definitely a sign of like not being cutthroat. They were probably, both of them, then far too nice.
Absolutely. And can you imagine if it was DC fighting Schumacher at the last race for the title instead of Mika, and he'd given away those points, because it was 10-6-4, wasn't it? So it's 4 points in between first and second at that point, with many fewer points on offer. So that would have been quite a deficit to overcome, and a bit of a problem. And as you say, whether I certainly wouldn't have seen Schumacher have done that, for example. The only one I can remember is, do you remember Hungary again between Hamilton and Bottas, when Lewis was behind Bottas and he said, let me past, I'll go and attack whoever it was in front. If I don't get him, I'll give you the position back.
Yeah.
And he did. He had to basically stop to let Bottas come back to get past him.
If that was Verstappen and he said, yeah, give me the chance to go through. All right, you didn't get through, so swap those positions back. Radio silence.
Well, didn't they? They asked Verstappen to do it once, and he said, "Don't you dare ask me to do that again."
To Perez, yeah, they
was it.
And he said,
Brazil.
know why? You know why? He looked at me funny that one time. Therefore, no, he used Monaco, I think, was the reason. So causing a yellow flag in Monaco to stop Verstappen progressing in qualifying. That was his justification for not giving back. By the way, P6, I think at the time, he wouldn't give up P6 to his teammate.
Yeah, and all the best of us have done things in qualifying at Monaco to prevent somebody else from qualifying, haven't we? They've all done that.
Yeah. So looking at this table for the 1998 driver standings, obviously only 10 points for a win. And I think, was it 8 points for second place at that time? I'm going to test your sporting knowledge here.
Ooh, I don't know when it changed from 10-6. I think it was still, no, it's first 6 positions. I think that came in the early 2000s.
Right, okay. So at this time it would have been 10 points for a win, and then 6 for second place, and then 4, 3, 2, 1. So only the top 6 getting points. So the gap was 14 points by the end of the season. So, you know, the equivalent of like a 40-point gap now. But why didn't Coulthard finish second if that was the most dominant car ever?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think they were dominant right at the beginning, but there was a couple of things that made them less dominant. And actually, it's kind of a link to today. So Adrian Newey was the designer for McLaren. He came up with this beautiful concept, but it was there were parts of it that were, shall we say, not above board. And there was a devious photographer that managed to put his camera into the cockpit and take a photo of the pedals, because McLaren had an odd third pedal in the cockpit. And this third pedal would operate the brakes in a different way. So they would choose one wheel to brake independently. It was one of the rear wheels.
Oh, so you could pick, okay, for this Grand Prix, we're either going to do the left side or the right side as our extra cam brake on its own pedal.
Yeah, absolutely. And what that would do is that would rotate the car better in the slower corners, and you tend to lose more time in the slower corners. If you can get yourself rotated quicker, you can get out of there quicker. So that was an ingenious thing to be able to make that car a lot quicker. And of course, there was a link to the Red Bull last year in Australia, where Max Verstappen's brake spectacularly exploded because they were doing a similar concept, but not with a third pedal. It was just asymmetric braking with a clever valve, wasn't it?
Allegedly. So, but with this McLaren one, no, I'm perfectly satisfied that it was. But with this McLaren one, yeah, you had to pick one side or the other. Did they see the brakes glowing? Because I suppose it would make your brakes overheat. And in Verstappen's case, it actually made the brakes catch fire.
Yeah, so even from testing, the other teams were going, why is only one of the rear brakes glowing bright orange? Yeah. So, yeah, and this is when they didn't have the wheel cover, so you could see it.
I don't know if you caught Sunday's show, what I was saying. We looked back at the first three races from last season, and as soon as you saw that the right-hand side rear brake catching fire, and then you connect it all to the asymmetric brake and you go, oh yeah, it's really obvious when you watch it then. But yeah, so obviously I would think that's just out and out illegal. So they were just told, right, you can't use that.
Absolutely. And they were for the following race. They still got a 1-2 the following race, but Adrian Newey said that system alone was worth at least 0.3 of a second per lap. So it was a really good system. And actually, interestingly, Jordan had also developed a similar system, but it was nowhere near as complicated. So they had to bin theirs as well. The other thing reason why Coulthard didn't finish second and they didn't just walk the championship is because of the testing that we talked about earlier on. So Ferrari have their own test track at Fiorano, whereas McLaren had to rely on Silverstone being available. So Ferrari had a whole testing team. They had a whole testing mechanics, drivers. They had a couple of drivers.
Oh, like a shadow testing team.
Yeah.
Wow.
And they would pound around that circuit thousands and thousands of miles, 4 or 5 days a week at some point during the season. And they could just test everything. There was no budget cap or anything like that. So they could put anything on the car and see if it worked. So they could catch up incredibly quickly through the season. And that's why kind of halfway through, if McLaren hadn't capitalized by halfway through the season, they were going to be in trouble. And there was some reliability that admittedly played a part on both teams, but the McLaren was incredibly fast, but very fragile, particularly from the Mercedes engines kept blowing up.
Right. And yeah. And so the comparison to this season is that we're going to have the flexi wings up until about race 11. And then, then people are going to get nerfed again. So here, this is where I saw, I clicked around the Reddit posts to see what people thought. And people were saying, that there's one title down to a dominant car, and you've still got to beat David Coulthard, and one title which was due to the Schumacher broken leg. I suppose we have to look at what we think of David Coulthard as an opponent. Now, David Coulthard is generally quite down on himself when you talk about why were you never a world champion. He just said, well, I wasn't fast enough ultimately. And it's a very gracious answer to give. But also there's a slight suspicion and a shadow that he just wasn't the favoured driver. So like Mark Webber being clearly in the end the number 2 when it came to upgrades and team orders and stuff like that. Is there any genuine suggestion that Coulthard in reality was the number 2, even though us as Brits were looking at that and cheering him on up until the point he didn't do well, and then he went from being British to the Scottish driver. Come on, we're cheering on British driver David Coulthard. Scottish driver David Coulthard didn't win the title.
Well, it was a really interesting one because DC had more success up to this point. He got a couple of wins with McLaren before Mika did. Although, that being said, we talked about reliability. Mika would have had a couple of wins in 1997 if it weren't for his Mercedes power plant blowing up. So Hakkinen was definitely Ron Dennis's favourite, and that's why they asked DC to move over for him in Jerez. And actually, you were talking about DC not having that killer instinct, and that's another instance of, he's very gracious and said he wasn't fast enough. That just, you wouldn't get Michael Schumacher or Mick Hakkinen saying
some excuses, man. Come on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, throw conspiracies at the wall.
All right, so I'll throw another one out there. So yeah, we're saying that DC wasn't quick enough, and I don't think there was any favoritism in that team. But my interesting point was that Damon Hill had a contract offer with McLaren to race alongside Mika instead of DC in 1998. He turned it down because they offered him a basic salary of something like 50k, which for an F1 driver is ridiculous, but with a huge bonus for every point they scored. So he would have ended up earning millions of pounds during the season. I think DC earned over 15 million for that season. Would we suggest that Damon Hill would have done a better job than DC in that car? And then would Mika then have won the title?
So interesting. When you were talking about this earlier, I thought you were saying, would Damon Hill have challenged Mika Häkkinen? But if you're saying, would he have done better than David Coulthard? Now I think that's probably more of a realistic aim. If you're going to say to me, would he have challenged Mika Häkkinen for the title? I think I, along with most people, would say no. I don't think so. And it's really hard to compare these because these guys haven't raced directly. But there was a lengthy interview with Martin Brundle that I found. I don't know if you had a chance to read through it. And he was describing both the drivers and saying, well, actually, I think Schumacher and Mika Häkkinen were pretty close. Maybe Mika Häkkinen on ultimate one-lap pace and Schumacher in the race, which is a common theme when people are talking about Häkkinen. There's a lot of references coming up that maybe he had the one-lap out-and-out pace, but managing through a race was slightly different. Then you have to say, well, is Damon Hill on the same level as Michael Schumacher? And I think nearly no one puts Damon Hill on the same level as Michael Schumacher. So better than Coulthard? Perhaps. But we had a comparison earlier, didn't we, with Hill and Coulthard at Williams? So
we did. Yeah. So in 1995, they raced a season together, and obviously the later part of 1994 when Coulthard replaced Senna. But I won't go for 94. We'll go for 95 because that was when DC was. So he was really green at this point. So he was really new. And obviously Damon had been in the team for a number of years, had been in title fights before. So he had a lot more experience. And so Damon Hill got more points than DC. So in 95, he got 20 more points. So that's 2 wins, essentially. He was on pole. Interestingly, though, Damon was on pole 7 times and DC was on pole 5 times in 1995.
That's pretty decent.
And if you think about it, that's a lot of poles for Williams when they didn't end up winning the title. So that's interesting.
Yeah, but Schumacher ran away with that in the Benetton that season.
He did. Yeah, he did, but not on single lap pace. I say Williams got more poles than Schumacher, but the wins, only Damon Hill got 4 and DC got 1.
But when Mika Häkkinen came in and was faster than Senna straight away, we were saying, oh yeah, that's because he had loads of testing and it's to be expected, new generation. When young David Coulthard comes through, we're going, oh yeah, but he was a rookie. You can't expect him to, go in there against the experienced Damon Hill. So which lane are we picking for a rookie? I think you have to say maybe Häkkinen was the better rookie than Coulthard then.
Yeah, definitely. And DC was a top quality driver, but was he that GOAT level that we're looking for? And even we're debating whether even Mika's in the GOAT level. So I don't think so. But you got to look at it as Mika outqualified Senna, who had most pole positions ever, and DC's going up against Damon Hill, who we've just said is not the fastest natural talent on the planet. So DC definitely took a little while to get into his stride. And yeah, so you're saying that Hill wouldn't have beaten Hakkinen. I think I agree with you on that one. But would he have taken enough points off of Hakkinen to then allow Schumacher to sneak in for the title?
Let's not give Schumacher any more titles. Come on, Catman. He got enough. He got enough.
Yeah. I think you're right. So yeah, I think it turned out the way that it should have done, and then we got that glorious 1998 Spa Grand Prix where Damon won for the Jordan team. So we'll keep that bit of history. I like that bit of history.
And he should have won Hungaroring that year as well.
Oh, 97 with the arrows. Yeah, he definitely should have done.
Oh, that was 97. Right, beg your pardon.
Yeah, in the arrows. Yeah, that was a really good race. Somehow he just dragged a car that was utterly rubbish and put it on third, and then was leading by the first corner. And then the only reason he didn't win the race against Villeneuve and Schumacher with infinitely better cars was that he got some technical problem and had to move over. So I don't know how that happened. I don't even think he knows how that happened.
Quick one. I'd forgotten Damon Hill raced 1998. Was that his final season?
99 was his final season. So he moved from Arrows to Jordan.
That's it.
In 1998. And he won Jordan's first ever race ahead of Ralf Schumacher in that wet race in Spa, where Schumacher smashed into the back of Coulthard because Coulthard kind of slowed up on the line trying to let him lap him, and then took off his front wheel, and then they had a bit of a fight in the garage. And that was the race where at the start of the race, half of the field imploded on itself going down the hill towards Eau Rouge because DC again managed to smash it into a wall. So it wasn't DC's finest day, shall we say.
I think if you'd have asked me, on the spot, when did Damon Hill retire, I would have said, yeah, he joined Arrows, nearly won in Hungary, and then just walked out the car and left F1. I'd put it out of my head that he was a Jordan driver for 2 years.
Yeah, funnily enough, the Jordan years are actually the years I remember most fondly for Damon Hill, because Jordan at that point was kind of the party team. So it was like the Red Bull when they first started. They were, the real fun team, and it was great to see them win. But Damon was, particularly in 99, he was outclassed by Frentzen. He was a shadow of his former self, and eventually kind of poodled out of the sport at the end of 99. So whether, as I say, DC is now in his prime in 1998, and Damon was on the down, shall we say, because he was a lot older, don't forget.
Yeah.
So, yeah, maybe he wouldn't have done a better job than DC, and maybe Hakkinen would have taken the title in the end.
Well, neither of them then, we think, would have challenged Mika Häkkinen for that title. And then that brings us into his second title in 1999. And by the way, I do apologise. I did say this was only going to be, a 35-minute, 40. Are you okay for time?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, let's just complete our plan then. And the reason that I certainly can spare time to do this kind of thing in the week is because of our patrons. We are Patreon supported. If you're a patron, you'll get an ad-free feed. And basically the amount of time we've been able to put into Missed Apex and all the other motorsport stuff and F1 social media and just doing this productively as possible as a job is because we're supported at patreon.com/Missed Apex. We have a disproportionately high percentage of Patreon supporters compared to our download figures, which means that we are doing much, much better and able to do way more than if we tried to fund stuff through advertising alone. So thank you very much to our patrons, and consider joining them at patreon.com/Missed Apex. So 99, Catman.
Yeah, so 99, the second title. And as you rightly said, it's up against Eddie Irvine, who I don't think anybody's going to class as GOAT level.
So Eddie Irvine was the number 2 driver at Ferrari to Michael Schumacher. So think Barrichello to Schumacher, think Raikkonen to Alonso, think Massa to Vettel. That's the kind of Ferrari partnership scenario we're talking here.
Absolutely. And Schumacher was the point man. Irvine was a good driver in his own. He was brought up through Jordan, and he was very, very fast, but not necessarily as consistent or as had the same feel as the others, like Schumacher and Hakkinen will have done.
Or as fast.
Exactly, or as fast. So,
or as fast even.
So it was less dominant than McLaren, but they were still the quickest on the grid. They got the most number of poles. Quite often it was DC and Hakkinen starting from the front row, but Schumacher would be able to get the results that he needed to be in the lead. And of course, particularly with the McLarens being more fragile. They're still having engine blow-ups at this point, still having problems. Schumacher was in the hunt and actually ahead mid-season. And then comes the British Grand Prix, which I was at, and I was actually at the corner, at Stowe Corner, in the grandstand watching when Schumacher, at the first lap, crashed into the barrier at a ridiculous speed and broke his leg. It was possibly one of the worst things I've ever seen live. It was absolutely
you were
horrendous. There? Yeah, I was at the corner.
Oh wow.
And yeah, it was really scary. But so he was out for almost the whole season, and so his main title rival has just gone, evaporated, and that you should leave Hakkinen with having a clear run to the title. He shouldn't be waiting to the last race of the season to be able to wrap this one up. But the fact that the car was unreliable and that Mika made a couple of big mistakes maybe nearly threw this title away for him and actually let Eddie Irvine have a crack at it.
Imagine if there was Drive to Survive during this time, because there was the infamous crying in a bush scenario, and he was just fully howling at himself. I don't know if you've seen an interview with him talking about it, and he's describing what he's doing. There was helicopter shots, wasn't there? Like, he tried to find somewhere to hide, but then the helicopter shots had found him, and he said he was just berating himself because he was saying, you're a world champion. Why are you still making mistakes like that? And so what you've got is a current F1 world champion about to win his second, having full-on imposter syndrome after making a mistake, and then after hiding in a bush and spotted by a helicopter, 20 years later, he's got to describe that in an interview because it was on telly, and I don't think he thought he was on telly.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? And actually, he did the same thing at Imola as well. So through a chicane, he just booted the throttle on the curb and just threw it into the wall. And so the Monza one where he cried in the bush was the second time in that season. And he's got to have it on his mind that Schumacher's coming back and he's not got the big competition, and he's still not able to convert the wins. And, because he was from the lead in both times. So simple rookie errors, really, that put him out of contention and actually gave both Irvine and Heysel Frentzen in the Jordan a shot at the title at one stage, because Frentzen won a couple of races and he was looking like he could, sneak in at the end. So what should have been another dominant victory turned out to be not so easy for him.
Yeah, and sorry, Mika Häkkinen fans. So I'm not trying to be negative. I don't think these are the two most glorious world titles. You can't accidentally win world titles. You've got to at least beat your teammate. So a dominant car with a very dodgy asymmetric braking system that they had to get rid of as soon as it was discovered. And then in many people's mind, and for a long time, the undoubted greatest of all time, Michael Schumacher, is your title contender in the following season, breaks his leg, leaving you with Eddie Irvine, who some people have speculated that the Ferrari board didn't want to win, because then you don't have the legend. It's the opposite of the Williams light bulb thing. Ferrari love a hero. Ferrari want their Fangio, their Schumacher, their Vettel to be the main person. So you don't want the Massa or the Barrichello coming in and just going, oh, well, anyone could have just won that title. So that was the rumor, was that actually they didn't want him to win.
I hadn't heard that one. That's
really
fascinating.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I hope it's not just something I read on Reddit once, 2 in the morning, great. And now I'm saying it on a podcast going, they didn't want him to win it.
Well, Schumacher is the 2-time world champion at this point, and he's come into Ferrari to lead their renaissance. I could definitely see a story there developing where they've gone, oh, hang on, if it's going to be the understudy who wins it, is that what we really want?
Yeah, this is the thing with Leclerc. You go, we've got the superstar Hamilton in $450 million, and then Leclerc wins anyway. Yeah, sometimes teams put their thumb on the scale. I don't have any evidence for that, and I cannot remember who was talking about it or where it was sourced. Feel free to contact us, spanners@missedapex.net. Feel free to contact us and correct. To be fair, Catman, people have not been shy in correcting you previously.
No, absolutely, nor should they be.
No,
but I will say that when Schumacher came back, so there were 2 races to go at the end of the season, he came back in Malaysia, got pole and fastest lap and made a huge lead, and then handed that to Irvine, so he could try and take the title. And then in the final race again, he got pole position ahead, and then he was by clearly the fastest driver, although they got very poor starts and then had to catch up again. But he was very clearly going to have made a much better fist of the title than Irvine would have done.
Oh, right. So he showed with those performances, no, I've got a better grip of this. And if you look at Salo, who was the stand-in, I had to scroll quite far down, only managed 10 points. Do we know how many races Salo did in the end?
Would have been about 5 or 6, right, I reckon, just off the top of my head. But if you look at people coming in to replace mid-season, even nowadays, I guess nowadays they don't get any testing, but back then, Salo was already driving for Sauber during the season, and then they just, because Sauber was essentially Ferrari's junior team, so they kind of shunted him up into Schumacher's position. So he had to adapt a little bit. But Salo put in some great results. Again, Salo was going to win the German Grand Prix ahead of Irvine, and Salo moved over. So Salo never won a race, but he did.
Oh, he could have been a race winner.
Yeah, absolutely. He could have been a race winner, but he gave that position to Irvine. So Irvine had so many gifts to him to be able to get him up to try and beat Hakkinen that it was it was unreal, really.
And then Eddie Irvine dumped by Ferrari at the end of that season.
Yep, replaced by Rubens Barrichello.
I wonder if that was going to happen anyway, or if that's like a punishment for not winning, or a punishment for getting too close to winning.
Yeah, maybe. But I think he was becoming less and less willing to play the understudy as well, even though he wasn't able to fight. Whereas I think, I don't know if Barrichello had gone in there with the strict intention of being the number 2.
I don't know. I don't think so. Okay, this is my bet from listening to interviews with him, is that he got slow played into that and then ended up doing it and knew by the end that he was doing it. And I think he was really unpopular in Brazil for that reason of like, why are you letting yourself be the number 2?
I mean, it's not a bad career that Barrichello had, is it?
No, he gets to drive around the world, be a race driver. Do you mean I would take the Hulkenberg curse, be a race driver for 15 years, but be destined to never, ever get a podium?
You'd make that deal with the devil, would you?
Yeah. So obviously 2000 is then when everything gets all Schumachery after 2000. And I call this the dark ages of my Formula One fandom. So we don't need to dwell on it too long, but sort of, it was 5 titles in a row, wasn't it? 1000, 2001, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
So it was those correct. 5 in a row before then Alonso, 05, 06, Hamilton, 07. Oh, no, wait, he couldn't do the China pit lane. Raikkonen, 08. So why didn't Hakkinen continue after 2000? He was young enough in that era to have continued.
Yeah, I think for Mika, what had happened was he'd put a lot into those titles.
Yeah.
And in 2000, he again took the title towards the end, but took it towards the end of the season before he was ruled out and Schumacher won it at Japan again. But I think the thing for Mika was he just had a family. He just had his son at the end of 2000, I think it was. And he was really struggling to get the motivation and the energy to fly around. And they were only doing 16 races a year, so I can't imagine what it would be like nowadays with that. But, it was just the relentless schedule. He felt like he was missing out on his family. And he said himself that he's had a couple of big accidents, obviously the one in 95. And he had a big accident in Australia in 2001, where he basically said to himself, I've got a family now. I can't orphan my children.
Yeah, and that's why Alonso was right around the outside or around the inside of 130R with Schumacher saying he will yield because he's got a wife and kids at home.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a weakness that should be expunged. But from all high performing sports people. But he still had his moments in 2000. Do you remember the impressive overtake through Spa with Zonta in the middle of the back marker? And he went, so the previous lap, Hakkinen tried to overtake Schumacher, and Schumacher ran him onto the grass down the Kemmel Straight. So he said, right, I'm not having that again. And the following lap, they came up behind Zonta. So Zonta conveniently parked his car in the middle of the circuit.
All the way down to the com, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So Schumacher went left on the racing line and Hakkinen went right to the inside and managed to get that double slipstream and fly out in front. And it was A beautiful move. I was going to say not.
Last time when we did this, I promised to put YouTube links in, and I remembered to. So I'll do the Adelaide crash and Zonta. I'll put links to those.
What many people don't remember about this, though, is that before this, the reason Hakkinen was having to overtake Schumacher, Hakkinen was ahead, but he'd actually dropped it on the exit of a corner, like the previous times on the throttle, and he'd spun, and Schumacher had got ahead. So he was actually making up for one of his mistakes again to do this amazing move. Nobody remembers that part of it because it was an incredible overtake, but it came from a necessity that he had dropped a leading position.
So, look, we're pretty much at the end now, but I've read a lot of things of people saying he made too many mistakes, and you're painting this picture of him being error prone as well. So we had Imola, Monza, here at Spa in 2000 that we've just been talking about. There was an interview I saw with David Coulthard who said that that McLaren was just incredibly difficult to drive. No matter how fast it was just very hard to drive, whereas Schumacher was incredibly comfortable in his Ferrari. So we could even say Hakkinen had a bigger challenge because his championship winning years was a car that really wanted to throw you off the road.
Yeah, and DC alluded to the fact that Hakkinen and Schumacher were more happy with a tail happy car than he was, and so they could control it better. So maybe that's why they had more of an advantage, because they could play with that, whereas some of the others that prefer understeer wouldn't necessarily have thrived in that era with the really light, dancey cars. So Hakkinen definitely had an amazing talent. He was really naturally fast. Being on that knife edge does make you more prone to error, and maybe he was able to control that less well than Schumacher was, which maybe puts Schumacher on a pedestal slightly higher. But I think he was still in balance. I would say nobody else on that grid would have done anywhere near close to the job that Hakkinen did, or got those two titles with the same machinery up against Schumacher. I don't think there was anybody better suited to do it. So in my book, even though he was flawed, Hakkinen was still the best guy for the job.
Okay, so we can say he beat or held off Schumacher in 98. We can't say he beat Schumacher in 99 because Schumacher wasn't present. And then he didn't beat Schumacher in 2000 and then retired. And my maths that I'm doing in my head, he was born in 1968. Only because Senna was born in 1960 and we said that he was 8 years younger. So I'm assuming that's 1968. Therefore, that would make him 32 in 2000, which is it's old enough to retire. But he got to his peak in his career and then retired. And I think to be considered up with the greats, you've really got to be mixing it around kind of multiple title fights across different regulation sets, preferably with different teams. That always looks way more impressive as well. Whereas Hakkinen never got to that. It was like a slow burn, a slow build, couple of title fights, took his opportunities, didn't take the next one, and then retired. You don't think you're in the conversation then, or we don't have enough data or information to be talking about him as one of the greats.
Absolutely. So you look at Alonso then, for example, who we talked about in our last one, where he has done exactly that. So he's lost multiple title fights. We were saying he could have been a 5-time champion if the wind had blown slightly different direction. So, that's across different teams.
And he's
in
a lot of title fights. And Schumacher was probably you could say he was in 10 title fights as well. Yep. And even Vettel was in 7 title fights, and Alonso too. Really, Hakkinen hasn't got the same amount of data points for us to judge it on. Those real clincher, clutch title battles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Mika himself said that he wasn't mentally ready to go for another title. That's why he took his sabbatical that then turned into retirement. And so, as I say, despite being fast and all that sort of stuff, and he was a really good driver and a really nice guy, but nice guys don't always win.
If you're gonna retire and you look back in history and you go retiring before the Ferrari 5-year trudge of crushing dominance, it probably was a good time to retire. You probably wouldn't have got anything else out of staying in the sport.
No, absolutely. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. And I don't think even Mika could have changed the outcome of the Death Star years.
Catman, thank you. I've kept you much longer than I said I would. Follow the links in the show notes to go and follow Catman. I think mainly over at Blue Sky these days.
Yep.
Yeah, and follow me, though. I'm the best one. I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky and Instagram. All those links will be in the show notes. We're coming up to the season now, and so we're going to be much more active. Some of the midweek shows that we do this season will be me solo, and I'll be just reacting to what's going on and some of your mailbag stuff. I'm probably going to stream those on a TikTok live as well. So if you are on TikTok, go and follow us there. So tiktok.com/MrApexF1. And I tend to jump on there daily during the season and just go, I think this about that thing. So imagine my tweets, except I just yell them at my phone. That's what the kids are doing. They just yell it at their phone. I'm just doing what everyone else is doing. Until we see you next, work hard, be kind, and have fun. This was Missed Apex Podcast. Oh, blimey, Catman. I think we've gone hour and 10 there. Sorry, mate. Come on, you've got cats to cure. He's a real vet, you know.
Some say.
And not like a farm vet where he's got, exploring the inside of cows. He's like we can save tiddles kind of vet. See you later.
Yeah.